Ever since I started photography back in the 70s, I've been interested in wildlife photography. But in the early days with a film camera, cheap Praktica, SLR with a 200mm lens, I really was struggling. The reach wasn't great, the image quality wasn't great, film was expensive, and the camera system was awkward to use, and there was no such thing as autofocus. Moving on a few years, I switched to a Nikon SLR. That improved things, the image quality was better, we now had autofocus, but cost and weight were a consideration and flexibility still wasn't great. Moving on a few years more, Nikon D200, things were getting better. I managed to put enough money together to get a lens combination that would give me close on 500mm reach. Autofocus, but low light performance was not great, and high ISO performance really, again, not that great. But moving on, I've now switched to micro four thirds. As I'm getting older, I don't really want the weight of the heavier gear, and the micro four thirds gives me an advantage in that respect, but it also gives me an advantage in terms of cost and performance. I'm sacrificing a bit in terms of sensor sensitivity and low light performance, but what I gain is a system that is very easy to move around, set up. The camera and the lens combinations are lightweight, which means that the support systems can also be lightweight, and now we have very effective image stabilization. So what I'm going to do now is show you the setup that I use for wildlife photography, and then go on and show you some pictures that I took recently using this setup, and then just illustrate going through the post-processing of one of those files, just to show how modern software can overcome some of the limitations that I'm seeing with the micro four thirds system. What I have here is my Lumix G9 micro four thirds camera, coupled with a Lumix 100 to 300mm telephoto lens. Now in full frames terms, that gives me the equivalent of a 200 to 600mm lens. And with the Lumix, that combination gives me 6 stops of image stabilization. There are two big advantages for me for this setup. The first is portability and lightweight, and the second is cost. The system together, the lens and the camera, cost somewhere around about 1100 quid, so a little bit cheaper than a top-end smartphone. The advantage of the weight means that I can now mount this on a really lightweight tripod to give me very easy access to wildlife photography without a lot of heavy gear to cart around. What I have here is the camera setup mounted on a Manfrotto Be live fluid video head, and I bought this initially primarily for doing wildlife videos, but I find it's a very useful setup for stills photography as well. And what I've got here is that head mounted, probably somewhat perversely, on a ball head. Again, a lightweight ball head. This is a small Manfrotto ball head, and the advantage of putting the ball head between the tripod and the fluid head is I can use the ball head as a leveling head. So that means that I can pan from a level base, and not only is it useful for video, it is also useful if I want to take panorama shots as well. I don't have to keep adjusting the tripod level. If the ground isn't quite level, I can use the ball head simply to level up the panning base. Going down, this setup is mounted on a Coleman Nano tripod, and this is very lightweight, less than 3 pounds, and the whole setup together is probably going to be no more than about 8 pounds in weight. If I take the camera off the tripod is easily held in one hand, and the camera I can put on an X strap with the lens to take with me. So incredibly portable. Now the other thing is the cost. The camera and lens combination is about £1,100, which for 600mm reach is really quite exceptional. The Be-Free live head I got in a sale, new, for £60. The ball head I've had for over a decade now, and I bought it originally to go on a monopod, and that cost about £40. And the Coleman Nano tripod, again bought it about a decade ago, really as a travel tripod, and that cost me about £60. So a very light, portable, easy to use setup. And what I'll do now is show you some pictures that I took at a local bird hide using this setup to give you some idea of the image quality that I was able to achieve. Well, having shown you the setup that I'm currently using for wildlife photography, I thought I would now just go through a few images that I took at a local bird hide. Now, a couple of videos ago I did show something with a few pictures with a similar setup, but in that case I was using an old Nikon lens on an adapter to the Lumix G9, and in that case I needed to use a somewhat heavier tripod setup than I'm using here, and that was very much by way of an experiment because I needed longer reach. In this case I'm looking at a slightly closer feeder, and this is the first image that I took, and what you can see here is you have got feather detail, but it's not an incredibly sharp picture. And if we look at the information for this was one of the first pictures I took in a sequence when I got to the hive. The light wasn't great, and I was really trying to balance ISO with shutter speed, and I really had to go down to about 125th of a second. That gives me two problems. One is people might argue, but I try to not go above ISO of 3200 for the G9, so I'm getting towards the top end, and 125th of a second for a bird that's bobbing around on a feeder. I've almost certainly got motion blur in there, so that is pretty much the upper limit. Fortunately, as time went on, the light got better, and so things improved. Slightly bigger bird, so we've got a pied woodpecker here. And again, if we just look at the situation, I'm still 125th. I'm still at ISO 2.5. It is a slightly sharper image, bigger bird, not moving as far, probably less motion blur. So this is an image that improved considerably with post-processing. All of these were post-processed using the protocol that I will describe at the end of this sequence with respect to one of the images. Several of these, again, a little bit sharper now. And then we get on to a number of shots of a grey squirrel which turned up. And now the light had got considerably better, so we're now ISO of 800. Again, 125th of a second. But if we zoom in, this is a reasonably sharp image. Again, it's been post-processed, so this is quite a reasonable outcome. Going on, let's just go down to some of the later ones we've got here. Now I've pushed the shutter speed up to a 200th, and the ISO on auto ISO is setting this to 1000. And then the light got a bit better again, and the one that I'm going to go through here is the one that was taken at 200th of a second, ISO 800. So this is the image that I ended up with, pretty sharp, and I will now take you through what I did to go from the initial image to the final image. So here we have one of the pictures of the grey squirrel that I took at the bird hide, and this is just being viewed in Adobe Bridge straight out of camera, so there's no raw conversion applied here. It is a raw file. If we zoom in with this, you can see that the image is reasonably sharp, but if we go in further, you can see that that is going to be compromised to some extent by the noise in the image. Just go back to look at the file properties here. 200th of a second, really that was limited by the light conditions. It should be enough to freeze a static a static animal, provided it doesn't swing its head round or suddenly move, but it is at the lower limit of what I would want to use. But that is giving me an ISO of 800. So there is a trade-off here. The lens is wide open. I'm shooting this manually, so I'm setting the lens wide open. I'm setting the speed, but I'm letting the camera set the ISO, auto ISO, because the light levels were fluctuating. And also, as these things were moving around, so they were going in and out of areas of shade, and it just wasn't practical to manually keep adjusting the ISO under these circumstances. So we have a compromise, as is often the case, shutter speed versus ISO in this case. And going back to the full screwing, that maybe leaves a little bit of motion blur in the image, but it is reasonably sharp. Now, I'm going to post-process this as I usually do in DxO Photolab 5. So if I switch to that, so here we have the image in DxO Photolab 5. I'm using the default adjustments for Photolab 5, so that is the lens correction. It makes some exposure adjustments, and so if you see, it's brightened the image slightly, and it has done a little bit of lens correction. Not great at this focal length. This is equivalent to 600 millimeters. I've adjusted the white balance. I set it to daylight. Originally, as shot, it was just a bit cooler, and as I remember the scene, it was just a little bit warmer than that. So the daylight setting is fine. Noise reduction to deep prime. Now this is the deep prime noise reduction routine that's built into DxO Photolab. It's an AI-based program now, and it does a very effective job of removing noise as the file is demosaicked. And what I will then do is export that into Adobe Photoshop, and I'm using CS5 here. And I've already done that, so if we jump to Photoshop now, and what I've got here is the image as it's exported from DxO Photolab. We zoom in here. What we should be able to see now is that the deep prime has removed the bulk of the noise and hasn't greatly compromised the sharpness of the image. At 200%, let's just step back to 100%. So the image is fairly sharp here, but there are some things we could do with this. Now, the first thing I'm going to try is something I'm afraid that if you haven't already got, you're probably not going to be able to get, and that is I'm going to use a program called Picure Plus as a filter. And if I go to the filter menu here, I've got this installed, I can then click on Picure Plus and it will run. At the moment it's not running because I've already done this. Now what that does is it applies a deconvolution routine. This is the sort of thing that is used in astrophotography quite a lot to correct for atmospheric distortion when you're taking pictures of objects in the sky, so stars and planets and so forth. There is a distortion that comes from the atmosphere, and you can use deconvolution software to improve that. Picure Plus uses that sort of technology to correct for the sorts of blurring you get from imperfections in the lens. The advantage of this is that it takes out the blurriness without doing the sort of traditional edge sharpening that you get with an unsharp mask. So if I now switch this layer on, what you can see instantly is that it has sharpened the image, but not with a classical unsharp mask. So switch it on, off and on, and you can see it sharpened things up. As you can't get Picure Plus, what about something you can get? And the other layer I've got here is the Topaz Sharpen AI. And I've used that as an alternative to Picure Plus. And if we zoom in here, again, you can see as I turn it on and turn it off that you do get significant sharpening. So if we go back to 100%, you can see I now have an image which is really quite acceptably sharp. zoom out a bit more. Now bear in mind this was shot at an ISO of 800 using the 100 to 300 Lumix lens, which isn't their top lens. Hope you found this interesting, and again thanks for watching and goodbye.